We're here to discuss the current issues in the Austin legislature and the potential impact on local nonprofits. And we have an incredible panel here in front of me sharing their insights. For the end of the discussion, we'll have about 10 to 15 minutes. That'll be open to Q&A. For those of you that are listening and watching virtually, please use the chat box for comments and the Q&A feature at the bottom of the Zoom for any questions. And then we'll handle questions here in person as well. Hopefully we get to everybody's. So with that, let's jump in. I'd like to introduce Ian Mitra. He's our moderator for today's panel. Ian is the senior managing editor at the Texas Tribune. He joined the Tribune after working more than 10 years, at the Dallas Morning News. He spent his first 7 years there as a copy editor. In 2008, he moved to the political desk, supervising the daily presentations and workings with reporters in the field. He then worked as a night city editor, supervising the coverage of late breaking news. He was also on the editing team for the 2009 and 11 legislative sessions. A native of Beaumont, Ian graduated with a journalism degree from the University of Texas, Austin. Help me welcome Mr. Ian Mitra.
All right, let's make sure can you guys hear me okay? All right, wonderful. Thank you so much, Carrie. And I would love to start off by introducing this extremely distinguished panel that I'm so proud to be a part of. We're going to jump into some questions and definitely leave some time for you all to ask your questions as well. I would like to start off by just from left to closest to my left to right. Denise Davis is a partner at Davis Coffin PLLC, a legislative law firm in Austin. Denise has worked in state government for over 20 years and serves on several nonprofit boards in Austin. Next to her is AJ Bingham, the founder and CEO of Austin-based Bingham Group LLC, a lobbying firm serving businesses, nonprofits, and trade associations at the municipal and state level. And then last but certainly not least is Esteban Daniel Delgado. He's an equity officer at the University of Texas at Austin, where he serves as the Director for Justice, Equity, Diversity, and Inclusion at the LBJ School of Public Affairs. Esteban previously worked in championing identity-based philanthropy and quality care for underserved populations in community health care. Thank you all for being here. Now, I'm just going to start off with just a bit of a baseline, just to make sure we kind of know what's going on with the legislative session, and then we've got some questions to get into here. Just to kind of set a baseline for how often the Texas legislature works. Many of you already know this, but they don't meet every year. They meet every odd number year, unlike most state assemblies. And by the Texas Constitution, they meet for 140 days. They meet from January through May. And when there are special sessions that are called, they can only be called by the governor. So we are holding this discussion with basically a month left in the regular session of the legislature, which is a critical time and a great time for this discussion, because now is when bills are moving fast and furiously, when the Senate is fighting with the House and the House is fighting with the Senate and everyone doesn't get along. But there's also a real time to make impact in terms of some of the bills that are being discussed, which means every day is crucial. And what we want to do in this hour, as Carrie has mentioned, is just talk about the impact of the legislation that really affects you and your organizations. And Denise, maybe we start off on that note about getting involved with the legislature. Can you talk a bit about the difference between the terms advocacy and lobbying, and why it's important for nonprofits to advocate and lobby for their mission and for their stakeholders at the legislature?
Yes, I think many of you, well, first of all, let me say, I'm looking at the clock that's on the internet that really counts it down by the seconds from, when the legislature is leaving. So it's I think 30 days and I don't know, 8 hours and 15 seconds or something like that. There's literally a clock. But as for the difference between lobbying and advocacy, I think certainly at the nonprofit level, I view advocacy as a very critical part of participating in the legislative process. Typically, when you're lobbying, you're going in and you may be representing an individual client, possibly for profit, on specific issues and arguing on those specific issues. Advocacy, I view as an opportunity to educate members, educate the public, educate other stakeholders on things that your nonprofit, that are important to your nonprofit. Now, in my, day job, I do a little bit of both. I advocate, which means I educate members. I also lobby and try to persuade. but I view the advocacy as being critical in both the nonprofit and the for-profit space, an integral part of what you do in the nonprofit world.
Thanks, Denise. AJ, there is a lot going on at the legislature. I mean, thousands of bills in the works, dozens of bills being discussed every day in committees and on chamber floors. What are the top priorities that are going on, that are being discussed at the legislature this session, and kind of what legislation is in consideration is of particular note for us in Central Texas?
I would say as of this morning, before I came here, there were about a little over 10,000 bills been filed since pre-filing started early fall of 23. Going into the session, the big priorities were around the governor's emergency items that included border security, addressing the fentanyl crisis, lowering property taxes. Some of them were mainline conservative items, and I think that's kind of holding through as we approach the end of session. Particularly for nonprofit groups, it's really tough to tell. I was looking at a list that had been developed a few months ago. It's easier to almost track from the beginning and zero through. There are a number of bills right now that have been filed that probably are dead just because of they're certain, and Denise and I really more on this. There are bill filing deadlines that if a bill particularly isn't out of committee, it's at a certain point, it's most likely dead. And it's filed and such, but that's it. And so there are most likely a lot of bills in some way, large or small, that will impact directly or indirectly nonprofits. What I will say is the best way to, at this point in the year and session, to focus on really is what passes, come Sani Die on May 29th. It's there are several associations that can help you with that, and a lot of it comes down to, I think, just it's the issues I would focus on are what impacts, I think, municipalities the most. There's one bill, HB 2127, it's an omnibus state preemption bill, which every major city in Texas is against it. The mayors are all fighting against it. It would remove a lot of power from local control. So particularly for nonprofits that do a lot of work with municipalities, cities, I believe counties as well, that in some way will impact you. But again, with nonprofits, I've served in several boards. The mission, it comes down to what your mission is, right? So it could be serving homelessness or combating homelessness versus transgendered youth. There's differences there. I think that there will definitely be a lot more bills. I think if your nonprofit touches certain social matters of the day, I would expect if you're probably already tracking those, to have some impact there.
Yeah. And Esteban, let's follow up on a couple of those things, because I know you're following some of the issues going on. And in particular, LGBTQ plus and higher education issues are very much front and center as we're monitoring. What are you watching, and what should we be keeping an eye out for?
Definitely. Well, I want to say thank you again for having me to the Impact Austin leadership. It's really a pleasure to be back with all of you. And to my fellow panelists, I'm really excited to be here with you today. Well, it's another doozy of a session. So why even is it important for us to care about this session? And I think for those of us that are really enthralled in this nonprofit space, it's because I think, are at the forefront of really working in ensuring that there's advancement in belonging and access, right, in Central Texas. And I think that really is important then to ensure that we really have a global view of what is happening at the legislature, right? I think as AJ had mentioned, there's so much going on, right, with so many different implications. But I think it's also important, right, to have that kind of global perspective, because it is at the end of the day going to impact, right, where ultimately the gaps in government are going to happen. And ultimately then where could our dollars as philanthropists, as nonprofits, really be able to come in and help that kind of divide that we see kind of happening, that kind of then really happens economically and then structurally. So some of the things that I have been keeping tabs on really since the start of this legislative session is the stigmatization of LGBTQIA plus individuals, both in the community and in the classroom, and the attacks on gender affirming care. This has been on the Lieutenant Governor's slate of legislative priorities. And these have been bills, right? A number of bills in this kind of legislative priority ecosystem have been bills that have been passed out of the Senate and have moved over onto House committees. And so these are bills that a lot of organizations such as Equality Texas have really been keeping an eye on and have really been trying to get people out to the legislature to be able to drop a card on, to testify on, because these are people that are neighbors that would be affected by these bills, people in our families. And we know that people thrive much better in the community when they're able to really affirm, right, and have that type of belonging. There are efforts and priorities this legislative session really to dilute and dismantle diversity, equity, inclusion, and belonging in our public universities. While I am a director of diversity, equity, inclusion at a state university, I do not purport to represent the university on this matter, and I just want to make that very clear. But in my own personal opinion, I think that this is going to be very devastating for us. We built up a lot of excellence in our university pipeline and being able to deliver excellent services for students who are coming from underrepresented backgrounds to our flagship universities. And when we are looking at the face of having to dilute or dismantle these programs and effectively practice diversity, equity, and inclusion from the closet, we lose all of that expertise and excellence. And we effectively tell our students that you don't belong here. So I think it's really important that we convey to our leadership and to our legislators that we are effectively doing a disservice to our students. I think we're also seeing bills that might strip further autonomy from our teachers at the K through 12 level. These are teachers that go out and find primary source documents, right, that we all read, I think, in our high school social studies classes, right, to be able to get a sense of what life was like throughout the history of our country, and not having secondary or tertiary sources dictated to us. And that is also kind of being, I think, pushed through at a legislative level. And then I think that there are also these ideas of voting rights and potentially ending of countywide voting in large municipalities and rural areas where it might take really long, car rides, right, to be able to vote in the county that you live in when you might be working on one side of the county and living in another side of the county. And so when we, I think, are looking at a legislative session, when we're coming out of a global pandemic, when we all are in our feelings and we're all kind of devastated at things that have happened to us, I think it's really important to stay engaged. It's really important to stay in the facts. And it's really important to keep an eye out on how we can contribute to the conversation and contribute to how we want to see the state moving forward.
Oh, thank you. And I think that you touched on a lot there, and it was great. I guess this kind of leads into a question that I was probably going to ask later, but like, I think it does kind of transition to like getting involved in terms of like how can, particularly like, in the midst of a legislative session where there are still committee hearings being heard, where you can still testify. This is a question for the panel too, of just like making your voice heard, regardless of the many issues that Esteban laid out that are still being considered in the legislative session. Can we talk a little bit about just kind of how to make your presence felt? Because it can feel overwhelming to go over to that big building and, with thousands of bills and to talk with all, to talk in such a formal setting, but it's really important for a diverse group of residents and citizens of the state to be heard. So can you talk about, maybe AJ, I'll start with you too, and then maybe to Denise, just what guidance can we provide in terms of, having your voice heard and making sure that multiple perspectives are being heard as this legislation is considered?
I think this might have applied to an earlier question you were asked later, but one of the prep work honestly would start pre-session. So ideally, you'd want to start cultivating similar like donor champions, right? Or your champions for legislature. So if this was the summer of 23 or 22 rather, I would say, identify, okay, and usually these issues are perennial, they're always coming up. So who are the folks who've been fighting it? Having those folks who are on the dais or on the floor with the folks who are fighting legislation. Those are the people who ideally are your champions. I would say so. Grass top level is those folks identifying one or two or three champions. And then as well, organizationally, getting your members, at the local level, the regional level, the state level to come in. A lot of groups have, they call them the lobby days or fly-in, or in DC, the fly-in days, where you have all your folks come in, wearing the same T-shirts, I think, X, Y, and Z, and you divide up, the House offices and say, great, this group is going to approach these 50 or 30 offices. These groups approach these 30. And can have the same messages, but it's all about them seeing that these offices, seeing that people care. A lot, again, 10,000 as of today, about 10,030 bills have been filed. A lot of things flying, a lot of priorities. It's a human business. These representatives and senators only have so much time. Their staff has so much time, and so what's going to really rise up, by and large, are things they know people care about. And particularly on statewide issues, it's beyond identifying the champions, identifying the detractors or the people who are promoting the issues you don't like. And if you have, and coordinating with people in their districts, their constituents, to make sure that that person is aware of the impact in their district, senator, house district, and then what that might mean for them at the voting booth. Please.
So I think what I would say is that the word I always think of is relationship or relationships. And I think that's what it really comes down to, especially at this time in the session as you're getting deeper and deeper into the session. And that is, you will be surprised at how effective having relationships with people that are in the same orbit as some of these members are, how effective that can be in helping you advocate and lobby. AJ has talked about basically coalitions, forming coalitions or finding stakeholders who have some of the same views as you. But I would also encourage you to research some of these members. Are they members of organizations, or do they live in your hometown, even though you live in Austin? Are you from Corpus Christi? Is your family from Corpus Christi? And what kind of a connection is, AJ was saying it is a human business. What kind of a connection can you make with some of the decision makers? I would also say that, yes, it's 140 days and we're about to fall off of a major cliff in terms of the calendar, the legislative calendar, and every day lots and lots and lots of bills die. And of course, they all come to the Capitol with wonderful ideas, but only 12% of those ideas become law. So it gets easier and it gets harder as you get deeper into the session, because you have fewer bills that are out there, but the stakes are higher and there are more things in those bills. So that, I think, is really one of the reasons why you do want to look at relationships and who you know. And then the third thing is, in the legislature, much of what is done, they only have one thing they have to pass, and that's the budget. All the other stuff, there are reasons, I guess, for doing it or not, but they have one thing that they have to pass, and it always comes down to money in many respects. And if you know people, or if your budget is going to be affected, or you're getting state funds or anything like that, find out who is making the decision on funding that might affect you, and affect the things that you're interested in. But the magic word for me is really relationships. It's finding people. I always tell my clients, do you go to church with this member, or your grandkids in kindergarten together? What kind of a relationship do you have to put a face on some of these issues. And I know it can be very stressful right now because the legislature has decided, I've worked for Republicans and Democrats, it's substantially more conservative than even the Republicans that I've worked for over the years. And I know it can be a little bit, jarring when you look at a lot of the issues that they're taking on. But we do have a bicameral legislature, and many of these things have only passed one chamber. And so I would encourage you not to walk away from the process. Many of these things are in the other chamber now. There's still plenty of opportunity for your voice to be heard.
Yeah,
I'd love to jump in here. There's so many great resources, I think, to stay on top of, I think the process and what's happening. And I'd love to give a shout out to the Texas Tribune, because I think the reporting that happens there is so great. I think bill trackers, especially from from a lot of nonprofit organizations that we rely on, are really great. And some of the ones that I keep, in my bookmarks tab are from Equality Texas. Every Texan has a great blog of different legislative testimony that they do. Move Texas. If you're looking at kind of voting rights and civil rights. Back in the day, I used to work for Texas CASA, and they have a really great legislative tracker if you are moved by issues kind of in the kind of foster care space. But I think also oral testimony is so important. Having your voice heard, right? The legislature does not belong to legislators. The legislature is the people's house, and we are the people. So really get to know how to go and expend your voice. Look up how to write a one-pager. A lot of amazing organizations in Central Texas do oral testimony workshops and how to actually write a one-pager, because when you go and do your legislative testimony, you want to give have a leave behind with your legislators. And they also, will do kind of web briefings or different in-person briefings on how to drop a card or register your opinion, right, in the House or in the Senate. But I also think it's really important to figure out, like, how do you feel about these issues? What do you actually think about these issues, right? Some of these issues are really, right, there's a lot to them. And how do they affect you? How do they affect us, and what's your why about them? And there's a great kind of framework that was really championed by Cesar Chavez and Barack Obama, and this professor at Harvard, Marshall Gantz, has a framework. So if you type in personal narrative Marshall Gantz into Google, you'll get the personal narrative framework on how to kind of tell your story of self and why an issue matters to you, why the issue should matter to your community, and why a legislative body should actually do something about it. And this is a framework that I tell to all of our students at the LBJ School on how you can affect change to a community. And it's actually how people create stump speeches and how people create legislative change in campaigns. So I really say to you, if you're trying to come up with oral testimony for the first time, go and look up Marshall Gantz's story of self framework. And I've seen Mission Capital do a training on this with Marshall Gantz's team members. They've contracted with his team out of Harvard to come and do it, something like that. Another great way is a lot of us maybe we're not good speakers, but some of us are amazing writers. And there are a lot of amazing op-ed opportunities through the Statesman and through other editorial boards. And so if you are so moved, please write an op-ed about how this is affecting you. We don't have to just stand by and be idle. And I think in a philanthropic space, right, from a nonprofit space, our priorities and the shifting landscape, right, matching up with where our dollars are going? And if not, looking for organizations or how we can shift our funding priorities to ensure that we're doubling down on nonprofits that are funding these access and belonging initiatives, right? Because ultimately we can ensure that we're crafting that change and advancement in the community that's being infringed upon. And I think just asking those hard questions, right? So much happened during the pandemic, and we had so many commitments to advancing racial equity and ensuring that this wasn't going to happen again. We're seeing a lot of slipping and sliding, right? And I think it's up to us to ensuring that we're asking those hard questions in those institutional spaces, right? To ensure that the institutions, right, keep those promises.
Thank you, Esteban. And that was a great list of resources too. I actually wanted to plug the Texas Legislature's resource too, which is if you Google Texas Legislature online, it's actually a pretty solid resource too in trying to find, you can search by bill number, but if you're like me, you don't remember any bill numbers. But you can search by topic, various topics. You can actually see what the legislation is. You can see the status of the legislation, where it is. You can actually see like if there are witness lists for committee hearings, you can see that. They actually have plain text.
Watch the hearing.
You can watch the hearings, exactly. So I think there is accessibility to that you don't have to actually be in the Capitol for, but to follow. But it's also really important to just kind of keep track to things like fiscal notes too, as well. And so, yeah, AJ.
This guy one feature for TLO as well is you can create bill tracking lists. And so more so for the beginning of session, or even now, you could say either, it was HB 5, make it a number 503, plug that in there for, X nonprofit tracking system, and it'll alert you when there's movement in that bill, right? Again, for most of us, this isn't our day job. So, and even if it is, we have other priorities going on in the day. So it alerts you when there's a movement in the bill, emails you, go on there and see the bill history and everything else. But I think the tracking part is probably the biggest feature given the number of bills are flying around, and assuming most people isn't their day job to watch the Capitol when a bill is moving, especially in a committee that's having 100 bills heard in one night.
If you're new to watching the legislature, so Jen Rice used to be a reporter here in Austin for NPR, and she won an award for a podcast that she did with The Organist out of NPR, I want to say back in LA. And the whole podcast was she rewatched, I think not the last legislative session, but the legislative session before. And the premise was that the Texas legislature is the best reality television show that you could ever watch. And she crafted this amazing highlight and arc. If you ever have a chance, go and look up Jen Rice's Organist podcast. It's about an hour. And it is a great resource on how to, one, actually use TLO and start watching legislative hearings online, but also like why you should stay abreast of the Texas legislature and why it's the best reality TV, because it is.
A lot of personalities.
Yeah, definitely. I want to ask a couple of questions about a couple of subject areas, and then before we move on, I want to talk about education a little bit first, and then disability rights, because I know those are issues that there's a lot of interest with this group about too. And like obviously, the Constitution of the state requires that we have a properly funded public school system, and that is a huge focus of debate in this current session. Obviously, there's a lot of advocacy going for vouchers, using public school money intended for public schools to be used as vouchers for students and families to use towards private schools, or I think. And I guess I just want to ask the panel group, and maybe AJ, we can start with you, of just in terms of like an overview of that debate and kind of the things that this group should know, just kind of as about such a important system that's functional in our state as public education.
Actually, I'm going to defer to Denise on that one.
Sure.
But I will say, I mean, it is of note for folks who are invested in public education in Austin, particularly just given we have the Robin Hood system. We're a very property rich school district, but a lot of that money isn't going to, a lot of the money is not going to Austin ISD students. And so, the voucher, and I'm not involved in that issue at all, but I know the voucher debate, if it, goes through, would it just add to that the lack of funding for our public schools potentially?
Yeah, and I was actually thinking, oh, good, he's asking AJ. I don't have to answer it, but let me just say, the way we fund schools is not the best way to fund schools, which is with property taxes and all of that. Which, and what AJ is referring to is the fact that I believe AISD sends about $800 million back to the state for education. So we need to find a better way to fund public education in Texas. And that's a conversation I think for another day. But with respect to what they call choice or vouchers or education savings accounts and all of that, in all the years that I've worked in the Capitol, which was nearly 20 years, you know, I've seen the conversation sort of take different turns. But one thing I will say is that the demographics of it are pretty complicated. You have rural Republicans who are against any kind of money being diverted from public education into private education. You have some Democrats who support some form of choice. What that means is, you know, different to everyone. Then you have the Catholic private schools who have their definition of choice, and you have all of these things. What I would say about it this session is it's really like a cat that caught the car, which is that you have the constituents who believe they have the votes to pass choice, but they can't agree on what choice is. So it's sort of interesting to watch. It's sort of like me with my kids and my husband when we try to figure out where to go eat. And we drive around for 2 hours and then we just end up at Chick-fil-A because we couldn't figure it out. But and so I think that much of what we can expect is if it doesn't pass, and the Lieutenant Governor said if nothing passes this session, he'll come back and bring the legislature back for a special session. I think it's probably got more momentum this time than I've ever seen in the past. When I in another life was House parliamentarian, we would always have a vote on the budget, on vouchers, and it would be in what you call the Century Club, which means that the vote would get over 100 votes against it. So that's the Century Club. And each session I've seen the numbers sort of change. So this time there were about 82 or 83 votes against on a test vote. And so I don't know if anything will pass. I think there's quite a bit of infighting on the issue. It's not just Republicans that are for it. It's not just Republicans that are against it. It's all these interesting and strange bedfellows. And then you have the squabbles between the two chambers and then the governor's bus tour and all of that. And it really is like a circus. So all I can say is I'm expecting something at the end of the day to possibly pass, not in, if not in the regular session, in the special session. And with these politicians, if they can call it choice, whatever it is, they'll consider it a victory. It could be the smallest thing in the world, which is, you know, a $100 coupon or something, and they'll go, I passed choice. So the devil is in the details, but I do expect politically the climate to yield some kind of choice legislation, either in the regular or in the special session.
I'm glad you mentioned about property taxes, you know, funding, you know, our public school systems, because, you know, we're having this discussion as we're also, as you mentioned, you know, we have a $30 billion surplus that we're working with. I think that's a number that's important to note here for the next 2 years in the Texas budget. And of course, a lot of the talk is about property tax cuts and how to do that. And, you know, while that sounds great, it's also that it's good to note the impact that actually has on a local level too when you're doing that. Esteban?
The math doesn't make sense. But we're focusing on a lot of other things this session and not the right one.
Everyone has a lot of great ideas this session. And I would say, you know, it's interesting when there is a surplus for decision makers, it can actually be more difficult than if you have a shortfall, because you just tell everyone no if you have a shortfall. But if you have a surplus, I mean, you really have to make some decisions and set some priorities and do some things. And certainly within the context of property tax reform, what does the surplus do in the long term? I mean, if you give property tax reform and it's a $500 discount on your property taxes for one cycle, is that really a good way to spend, you know, a $37 billion surplus or what have you? So there's a lot of debate about that. And then in the meantime, we do have these issues with employee pay raises, teacher pay raises, infrastructure, and all of these other long-term investments that we need to make as well.
we're trying to make better a regressive form of taxing, right? I mean, I think it was a Tribune article, right, that the people that are moving here from California, big municipalities like San Francisco, LA, right, we are ultimately being taxed more than them, right? Even though we are supposedly only being taxed once, right? And they're kind of coming over here and kind of being like, I thought it was going to be living better, and ultimately they're being taxed more than when the place that they're coming from. So it's unfortunate.
Well, I want to shift a little bit on topics here and talk about what's happening in the legislature, or what's not happening in the legislature when it comes to disability rights. There are a couple of bills that have moved that have, I'll just name a couple. House Bill 195. This is a bill that would ensure that students with disabilities are part of any planning for mandatory school drills, disasters, or emergency situations. That has actually passed the House and is being considered in the Senate Education Committee. Another bill, House Bill 1604, also referred to as the Senate Higher Ed Subcommittee, would require the Texas Higher Education Coordinating Board to report on the challenges that students with disabilities face in higher ed, to make sure it's documented in Higher Ed Coordinating Board reporting. And a third bill in the Senate, which has actually passed the Senate, would address procedures in addressing intellectual and developmental disabilities when it comes to guardianship proceedings. These are just some of the bills that are moving, but I want to ask kind of like a general question when it comes to the aspect of disability rights. This is an open question to the panel here, which is just kind of what is being done that should be done and what's not being done when it comes to this issue. And, what would you like to see? Again, repeating that we are in a session where we have a $30 billion surplus to address things beyond just, issues of property taxes and stuff, but just what are the things that we should be focusing on that probably aren't getting as much attention in the legislature? And I'll just open up to the panel for who wants to start there.
I can start. I mean, I think that I feel like a dinosaur up here, actually, when I'm talking about the way things work. I think interestingly enough, it is not an issue that I've heard anything about in terms of like the top priorities that are coming from the big three, as they say. I haven't seen that. Now, one of the things that I think that, you're talking about mental disabilities, physical disabilities, both, or what, I'm not sure, but there has been a lot of focus lately on learning disabilities and mental health and providing, because I do view mental health as a type of disability. And so there's been quite a bit of focus on that at the legislative level, but I haven't seen as much conversation take place on physical disabilities as much as I would like to see. And that might be because we don't really have, for years, we had at least one or two members of the legislature that were advocates or champions on the issue. Sometimes they would be physically disabled as well. And we don't really have anyone, I think, that's a champion on that, it's like their main issue or anything. Probably the person that I think of off the top of my head that's been an advocate would probably be Donna Howard. I think she's been pretty active on it over the years. She's a nurse by training, and it has been a passion of hers, but I haven't seen it be a priority.
Yeah, and I think one of the things that the Tribune wrote recently too, I'm glad you mentioned mental health too, is the aspect of Medicaid when it comes to this, which is the fact that while there's a desire to increase mental health funding, the challenges with currently with the state of Medicaid in this, here when it comes to mental health services, what Medicaid pays for, and is not going to compete with like private insurance when it comes to getting treatment and getting appointments. And so a lot of therapists are going to they're going to go with a lot of patients with private insurers quite often, and so that's a challenge too when it comes to that type of service, which is a budget issue as well. But also we've been hearing a lot of talk about mental health services, but I think there's a challenge too in terms of like the funding aspect of what it means to support that.
For years, the conversation was, I mean, you're familiar with the, I guess with the term Medicaid expansion. And our legislature does a lot of contorting to not have to say those words, and they don't like to talk about Medicaid expansion. But I found it interesting that it is becoming more and more of a trend, even in the states where there are Republican legislators, because of budget crunches and demands on services and things like that. And I do think there is a good conversation to be had about, you're hearing more and more Republicans talk about it. They call it different things. They don't want to call it Medicaid expansion, but I think there needs to be more conversation about that money and what it means to expand Medicaid. And what I say to members is, it's our money and it's going to other states because you don't want to call it what it is. So I think it's time to have a conversation about that so that we can provide money for those services. We're not going to have a surplus every time, we go into a legislative session.
Okay, I want to make sure we have time for questions for you all to ask questions. I'm just going to ask one quick question for the panel as you're kind of thinking about questions, and I think we'll get a mic to pass around too. But just kind of a broad kind of question of just like takeaways. What else do we need to know in terms of like the legislature, whether it's specific issues or we've gotten into the aspect of how to advocate. But just kind of, what other takeaways do you want to make sure we kind of leave this discussion with? And Esteban, I'll start with you and we can come down this way if that's all right. You may have covered it because you've covered a lot already.
We've had a comprehensive conversation. I love being on this panel. I'll just say, I think fairly evident, it's not over till it's over, I think. There's been so many, I think, past legislative sessions where there have been points of order called on bills. There's been, I think, nights of political action that have happened. And so I think a lot of different constituencies always have, I think, different tools and tactics up their belt or up their sleeve, right, to try to get what's best for the people. But I'm really intrigued to kind of see how things kind of play out this session, because it has just kind of seemed like more of a we're along for the ride, if from my perspective. But I am deeply kind of concerned at how things will land and how the nonprofit community and others in the social impact space will have to kind of grapple at what we're left with at the end.
I would just advise, given we're on the session, similar to donor campaigns. I treat this session as every session is like a war, but it's about the long term, basically, like it's a campaign. A lot of the items, they might come up the surface for, make the news, but they've been in the background bit by bit advancing for decades, not more so because our government, our capital meets every odd year. I think it's, planning for, we're already internally, we're looking at 2025 and what do we want to accomplish then now, right? I think that work really begins once session's over and you can have a chance to look at what bills passed, what advanced. Also paying attention to national election trends. We're entering a presidential cycle. What issues are going to get more prominence that might coincide with a legislative session or an election cycle, prior to that session to develop new champions or such. But from our view, it's a year-round kind of a game of preparing and analyzing, and some champions fall, some champions rise, as does opposition. And I think it's knowing all that and being that intelligence informs your advocacy and your lobbying too.
I think I want to leave you with something that's also important, which is don't underestimate the power of the staff in the legislature. For example, I think someone told me we had over 80 new chiefs of staff in the House or something like that. They had quite a bit of turnover last time. And maybe this goes back to what I said about relationships and things like that. But if you are trying to, make your voice heard, talk to the staff, because they have a really good opportunity many times to influence members in ways that you don't know. And so I just would encourage you to don't walk away from the Capitol and, just shut the books on the session. There's still a lot of session to go, probably a special session. Don't don't make any vacation plans, but, and there's still a lot of session to go and, a lot more educating and advocacy, that can be done, and reach out to us if you need help and you need advice.
Thank you all. I think we have some time for questions. We have a mic here. So
That one over there. Hi, Beth. Glad to hear the mention of Medicaid expansion. The other health-related issues I hear a lot about, of course, is the fentanyl crisis, as well as gender-affirming care. Given the abysmal state of healthcare in our state, is anything moving with rural hospitals, and how are we going to protect them? What about the maternal death rate, early childhood death rate? Anything in those fronts?
Yeah, I mean, I will tell you that on the rural hospitals, there's quite a bit of conversation around that. And as you probably know, a lot of the money that the rural hospitals receive they receive, through federal funding and through drawdowns and things like that. Quite a bit of conversations about that. I don't know what's going to happen with, I view that as sort of a sleeping giant. We have rural hospitals closing and they aren't really talking about it in the way that they should. Now the rural members get it, and the hospitals that do what I call intergovernmental transfers, technical, but they draw money down to give to the rural hospitals. They care about it, but I don't think it's popular or sexy enough yet, and it needs to be. So I totally agree with that. The fentanyl issue is one issue that has really garnered quite a bit of bipartisan support. There's a bill, I think it's already, or if it's not on its way to the governor's desk, it's going to get there. And so Dr. Oliverson has had bills on it. It was a major issue for the governor and all of that. So I think that is one of the few bipartisan issues that I've seen members discuss and talk about. Gender affirming care, as you know, that is an issue that came out of the Senate. It's, I believe, now over in the House. There's still a lot of discussion to be had over that. Many of those bills in the House go to State Affairs, which is a huge committee. And that is I would encourage you to watch that committee. It's a very interesting committee, got a very interesting demographic on it. It's what I call like if you were thinking of, High School Musical, I guess it would be like the cool kids table or something like that. You have Zimfronia Thompson's on that committee, Charlie Guerin. You have some very serious members on that committee. And I'm going to be watching that discussion to see what comes out of that and what happens with that. So, but I'm with you on the rural hospitals. I feel like that's a sleeping giant, and that we don't talk about enough.
Hi, Denise, you had mentioned or alluded to that there's a likely expected special session. Are those typical here in Texas? And if they are, like, how do you see those impacting like the political power dynamics through the month of May, and then what gets landed or not in a special session?
Well, I will say this. Let me put a caveat on the special session, because members want to stay married if they can, and nothing damages a member's relationship with their spouse more than a special session, because they've been at home for 6 months, and they've been carrying all the responsibilities, and now you're telling me you're going to be gone all summer when I thought we were going on vacation. So there's a human dynamic to it, first and foremost. But it is a reality, and it is a possibility. When I worked in the Capitol, they were to be avoided, and you would always have a grand bargain at the end of session to preserve, family stability over the summer. I see them used now more as a political tool. I can stop this, so I can call a special session and all of that. I am not quite sure what will happen with that, because sometimes when you call a special and you get members here, you don't really get what you think you're going to get. I mean, you get angry members, and it may not turn out the way you want. But I would expect a special probably sometime after the summer vacations, sometime in the fall. I've seen them happen more and more. I think we did it on redistricting the last time or something like that. And the lieutenant governor had, I think, 30 items or 30 something items on his list or something like that. And the governor had a bunch. And so between those two things and the speaker had a ton, I think you can expect that. They are not meant to be popular and they're not meant to be common. The Constitution limits what you can do in a special. The governor calls it, he sets the agenda, but the legislature gets to interpret the agenda and what that means. And they have their rules in the Constitution for doing so. But I think it's been used more and more as a political tool than I've seen. The last time I saw it really used that way was in the early 90s. And I think we had 6 specials back to back over, I think it was workers' comp or something like that.
I think to add to this a little bit, I mean, our last special session was in the lead up to, I think, the governor's race, right? Abbott versus Beto O'Rourke. And we really saw the special session, and correct me if I'm wrong, kind of lead up to the dismantling of women's choice, in Texas. And so I totally, right, would expect a special session, especially kind of as we kind of figure out whether or not our governor has ambitions of whether or not to be running for a national office. And really, I think looking at those legislative priorities for the governor and the lieutenant governor and seeing which of them get passed and which of them don't get passed, looking to other states, right, in our country that might have kind of similar leanings, and whether or not our governor has certain posturing that he might need to do to be kind of a national player.
And I do think, I was just going to say, and I do think it really does depend on the temperament of the legislature. I mean, I remember there was this big conversation about the bathroom bill, and they called a special on the bathroom bill, and it didn't pass in a special. So you just never know what the temperament of them. I would caution against calling specials for entertainment purposes because it can be dangerous, I think.
So come back to following that national trend. So Florida's legislative session this year lines up more or less with ours. They're going to end in May. I think from what I've been reading, their governor DeSantis is planning to announce for his bid for president mid-May. So I mean, all these things kind of align. You look at what the governor's doing, what DeSantis is doing in Florida, from Disney, and everything else. It lines up to, okay, well, how does what's our governor going to do to line up his modifies with CPAC and everyone else? So
we have things going on in Tennessee, right? Well, that governor might not have same presidential ambitions. There are certain legislative activities happening, right, that our governor might be looking to.
I mean, again, it's serious stuff, but it comes down to the High School Musical thing of they're doing that. Okay, I got to at least be, if I want to be a contender for maybe pundit job at some point, I got to do something similar.
We didn't talk about guns, which is always out there as an issue.
It's on. Hi. Back to grassroots advocacy. You talked about written testimony, oral testimony. How effective or ineffective are public demonstrations, such as the Women's March on the Capitol? And we're out there on weekends, and when the legislators are not there. So are they not effective?
I think that I think political action can be effective, right? I think it can keep the momentum moving, right? I think one thing that I would say there is I think that look back to Wendy Davis's time as a state senator and the cheer buster that happened at the end of that legislative session that kept women's right to choose intact for a whole nother legislative cycle. Political action can be very, very effective.
I think it's important just because I think of the opposite. If things get passed and no one says anything at all, right? There's degrees of damage, right? And I think if the people passing or pushing legislation are watching, and constantly looking at the temperature. They have firms that read the temperature. So if they pass or try, they test a bill, they'll test a bill or some priority, and no one's protesting at all. Well, great. We have that. We can probably do more, right? So they know there's limits even then. Like sometimes, it's it might be a loss, but it's a lesser degree than what could have been because they saw what the amount of publicity and visibility was on the issue, right? So I would look at it that way as well.
And it also helps your champions. I mean, that's what I think. I mean, if you're not out there, I mean, they draw energy off of that. And so I think are you going to change opinions of people who are never, there are some people whose opinions will never be influenced by what you do. But I think that it's much more complicated and nuanced than that. If you have someone that's advocating for you in the Capitol, they need that. It's another way that you're letting your voice be heard, and they need to know that so they can continue to champion for you. Well, why am I working on this when they're not even, I don't hear them talking about it anymore.
Do we have any other questions? I think we are at time. So please join me in thanking this wonderful panel for wonderful. Thank you, everyone.
And for everyone that's here and virtual, first, thanks so much to all of you for joining us today. We really appreciate it. It was super informative. We have some QR codes spread throughout the room. If you wouldn't mind scanning that and letting us know what you thought of today's event, it's really important to us to improve these events and make sure that we're listening to what you all want to hear about next. And for those of you on Zoom, Nicole just dropped the link in the chat, I think. So if you have a chance before you log off, make sure to check that out. Thank you so much for being here, guys.